Hello, good morning, good afternoon, good evening to those of you joining us from across the world, and thank you for being with us. Welcome to part 2 of the Sanofi and Regeneron Alliance sponsored podcast, 5 Years of World AD Day, with myself, Siân Jones, and Professor Stephan Weidinger. So in the previous episode, Professor Weidinger and I discussed the creation of World AD Day 5 years ago and the progress made in disease awareness in that time. And of course, we also looked at the key unmet needs amongst patient groups, and we touched on the often underestimated and undertreated mental burden that comes with atopic dermatitis. Now, Professor Weidinger, thank you so much for being with me here again. We're going to be considering the importance of disease awareness in AD, as well, of course, as the need for multidisciplinary care, looking at why treating patients holistically could improve outcomes. And it's quite interesting to pick up on what you talked about earlier, is that actually we know that AD is not taken as seriously as other diseases, despite being a chronic one. Why is that?
I think one big problem are the many misconceptions around the disease. Many people still think that it's a childhood-only disease that outgrows in most. And we also know that physicians tend to focus very much on the current visible skin signs and not always assess the full impact of the disease on the patient's lives. They do not sufficiently assess the quality of life of the patients very often. But in fact, in particular, patients with more severe disease, they very often require a multidisciplinary care that you mentioned already.
Yes, absolutely. And I'm interested to know, my daughter has very, very mild atopic dermatitis, but you said that actually, you know, for some adults, it could appear out of nowhere at any stage.
I would first ask you, how do you know that the disease is mild only in your daughter? Are you sure? Or is it because the skin signs are mild?
The skin signs, indeed. The skin signs come very sporadically.
Yeah, but that's one of the problems. So there are patients around that have mild signs only, but very intensive symptoms. So the burden is not only made up by the signs, but also by the symptoms. So.
Yes.
First of all, I would recommend
yes.
you to make sure that it's really mild disease only. And then the second thing is that the disease is unpredictable in its course. So you never know whether the disease will stay mild or become severe later on. And therefore, it is important to sufficiently manage the disease and keep the disease under control to avoid worsening of it.
Absolutely. And so let's come to that multidisciplinary point that you mentioned there. What does that actually look like in the context of AD? Can you give us some examples?
Yeah, so in fact, there was a very interesting recent initiative, the Quality of Care Initiative in Atopic Dermatitis, that provided a lot of good information on that. This was an initiative where more than 30 centers of excellence in AD care were surveyed and visited to find best practice examples. And in fact, several of these centers had implemented so-called coordinated multidisciplinary teams. And it turned out that these teams increased the quality of patient care tremendously. So such multidisciplinary teams typically comprise dermatologists, of course. They are important for establishing the diagnosis and for developing the treatment plans, but very often also allergologists, because we know that allergies are a major trigger factor in many patients. Then psychologists, they can help to develop better sleep routines and coping strategies. And then also nurses can play an important role in helping patients to manage the disease on a daily basis. And we have seen that in that quality of care study, that at those centers where there are these multidisciplinary teams, the satisfaction of the patients is much higher and the quality has improved.
Absolutely, but what we need to see more of is more of that. I mean, that's an awful lot of people to put together in that team. Would you say that that is sadly lacking in most places, though.
It's getting better, but there's still a need to distribute such best practice examples across the community.
Absolutely, and great evidence.
And in fact, the World AD Day helps in
Yes.
this respect.
Okay,
also.
so that's amazing, isn't it? So dermatologists, allergists, psychologists and nurses all being involved is going to provide better outcomes. And I actually had no idea that so many people could be involved in that sort of holistic approach. So aside from dermatologists, what are the key areas where that additional support for patients is actually required?
I think very often it's required for mental health, for the psychological aspects of the disease. So psychologists, and we have one working in our AD unit as well, they can play quite an important role in the management of AD, at least in those patients that have more severe disease and that really have mental health problems. They can, first of all, help identify the psychological trigger factors and then apply appropriate measures. So, for example, effective coping strategies. They are also important for the early identification of manifest psychiatric comorbidities. They can help to create routines and structure in the daily management. So they can be very helpful.
Absolutely. So give me an example of somebody that's come in where a psychologist has got involved at a very early stage, and why?
You mean from our own patients?
Yes, absolutely.
So if you dedicate sufficient time during your consultations and talk openly to your patients, then very often they tell you that they feel a lot of stress, that they feel uncertainty, that they are anxious. And this is then when we offer our patients an appointment with our psychologist that is in the department itself.
And one thing that resonated with me was something that you said in the first episode of the podcast, which was actually people wake up and they have no idea what to expect. You know, that must be terrible living with the burden of that.
It's in fact a major stressor to the patients, that unpredictability of the disease, that you never know, will I be able to, I don't know, go swimming today or tomorrow? Will I be able to participate in sports? So you wake up and you cannot be sure what the disease is going to do over the day.
Absolutely. Or even, you know, have I had a good night's sleep and can I function well in
Right.
my job, you know?
Right.
That's really, you know, an incredible insight for me to know that. So what else? So we've talked about psychologists. What about the other groups that we talked about? So the allergists, for example.
Many patients with atopic dermatitis also suffer from allergies, and these allergies can trigger the disease. So it's important to identify them and then try to avoid these trigger factors. And allergists are of key importance in this respect. They can do the appropriate allergy testing and then also provide recommendations to the patients. In some cases, they can also do specific therapies like immunotherapy to help patients to develop a tolerance against the allergens.
Okay.
So I would say allergy diagnostics and therapeutics are an integral part of AD management.
And what about the nurses? They obviously play a huge part.
Yeah, they very often, at least when they are trained nurses, can be extremely helpful for the patients. They can provide guidance between consultations with the physicians. They can explain things because they might have a bit more time than the physicians. And in our department, our expert nurses, they very often develop a good relationship with the patients over time, and very often they are their first point of contact, at least in between consultations.
And you know what comes out loud and clear for me is the fact that patients need to feel like they're being listened to.
Absolutely. That's something we hear quite often from the patients, that they feel not sufficiently seen, and they feel that their disease is not seen sufficiently as a whole with the whole impact.
Absolutely. And so we have obviously work to do there, but where you're working and when they have that holistic approach, what sort of things are they saying to you as a result of having all of those different aspects looked at?
They say that they really appreciate this model, that different experts look at different aspects of the disease, and they feel good taken care of.
Yes, absolutely. So that's good round holistic care. So that's a brilliant example there. Let's come to the physicians and the signs that they actually should be looking out for to suggest that a patient is struggling with mental health impacts. I know we've already talked about that when I asked you about that example. Mm-hmm. Is there anything to expand on there that you can share?
I think it's important that the physicians, first of all, are aware of the impact of AD on mental health and that they look out for signs of impaired mental health. So this can be constant fatigue or a lack of energy or an inability to concentrate, or that patients feel easily overwhelmed or have a low mood. But of course, it requires sufficient time for conversation, and that's very often a problem, to be honest. And then we also have quite well-established tools to systematically screen for signs of mental health problems, such as the hospital anxiety and depression scale. So I think the key thing is to be aware of the fact that patients may have mental health problems, and then have a sufficiently open and sufficiently long conversation with the patients about these aspects.
Absolutely. And let's talk about, so we know that, patients often think, oh, well, I don't want to bother anybody. I don't want to worry people, so I'll stay away. How important is it that they feel that actually they should be able to come in, however big or small the problem relating to AD, and actually be heard?
That's very important, in fact. So you're right. Patients are often afraid also of talking about the aspects we mentioned, talking about mental health problems. So you have to create an atmosphere of openness, and then over the time, patients will become more open and then inform you about other problems they may have through their disease.
Absolutely. I know in episode 3 we're going to be talking about, what the future could look like, but it seems to me loud and clear that this holistic approach is fantastic. If we could get everybody talking about that and doing that. But for now, though, what can physicians do to ensure that more rounded holistic approach in their consultations happens? You mentioned that, of course, there's a lack of time, isn't there, very often?
Yeah, it is. But I always say, if you dedicate more time, especially upfront at early visits, this is also an investment, because in the end, you probably take care of a patient over a long period of time. And then it is a good investment to have enough time in the beginning and to find out the impact of the disease in the individual patient, really, and to better understand the overall clinical situation. So that's very important. And then I think we physicians, we must always try to get better and educate ourselves. Also, for example, in mental health screening that we already talked about.
Mm-hmm. And also we talked about communication models and tools. So we know the communication model, we've taken the time to discuss and look at all of those different areas. What other tools are available?
So this is in fact an important aspect. So in our hospital, we had a big initiative, that's the shared decision-making initiative, and all physicians, also in our department, received a training also in communication by communication experts, and that was very helpful. And we also then, half a year later, asked our patients, did you feel any difference in the communication? And many of them said yes.
Okay,
so it worked out in the end.
You did indeed. Yeah. So that's a wonderful example. Let's talk about policy makers. We haven't really discussed them, have we? How can we initiate conversations with them to educate them on the full impact of AD, would you say?
Yeah, as you said, so it's important to engage with policymakers. They are, of course, important when it comes to improving patient care and guaranteeing access to good treatments. Patient organizations, in fact, can be very helpful, and also initiatives of patient organizations, such as the World AD Day. In the end, of course, you must convince the policymakers, and for this you need good data, and then you need to explain and communicate about the data in a way policymakers can understand. Mm-hmm. So you have to translate research finding in a way that policymakers, that it's more digestible to policymakers also. And we already mentioned several important studies that were very helpful when engaging with policymakers. So, for example, the AD gap study, but also the quality of care initiative.
Absolutely, and it says here that physicians ranked feeling ashamed because of AD as the #1 impact, while children, adolescents and caregivers ranked disturbed sleep as the largest impact. I mean, this is hugely important in raising awareness, isn't it, to policymakers?
Yeah, it is important that policymakers understand that the disease has an impact not only on the patient, but also on the families and caregivers, and that the perception of the disease is different between these groups.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much for your insights. That's absolutely fantastic. So we look forward to the 3rd episode. So Professor Weidinger, thank you so much for that. And thank you so much for watching and listening and being with us. So do join us for that 3rd and final instalment of 5 years of World AD Day, when we're going to be looking at what the future could hold for AD management and how we can achieve this. Until next time, bye-bye.